Do you ever stop and give any thought to the fact that your days here on this earth are limited? I mean, we might have a desire and a goal, perhaps a goal that really, at the end of the day, we don't have total control over. But we have a goal and a desire to reach old age or to live as long as we can. And sometimes, depending on how we treat the body, that we might be doing things and taking steps towards that aim. I mean, people dream about perhaps living to be 70, 80, 90, or even 100 years old. Never mind that when you reach that age, when you get up there, life isn't as what it used to be before, just as far as what you're able to do with your body and that sort of thing. But the point I'm making is that, there's this idea of long life and long living, and just even how I've just described it, long life and long living. But the point that I want to make in this episode and what Scripture talks about is the fact that even what we would consider long life is not long at all in the sight of God when we put it on the backdrop of eternity. And so if we have a true understanding of our days and the limit of our days, then I guess the next question would be, how do we live this life right now? Or at least, what is the beginning perspective that we should have? What should we be pursuing in the time that we have on this limited time that we have on this earth? And so, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. It's not what we're going to talk about here may sound depressing, but it does have an element of hope and truth to it that I think that we can take encouragement from. Okay, so don't get don't slump your shoulders or anything and think that we're headed down a path of being a downer here. I mean, it does, what we're looking at here does bring us to the reality of life itself. The limited nature of our lives, and even what our lives are filled with. But then the prayer that's laid out that we're going to examine here, and just appealing to God to help us to have a right perspective on our days and how we should be using those days, is kind of what we're going to be looking at. And specifically, the specific text that we're going to be looking at in this episode is Psalm 90. So we're back looking at a psalm. So I figured that this might be a good one for us to examine and look at here. And so this is what we have here in Psalm 90. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole psalm so you know what we're dealing with here. And it says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, my goodness. I can read. I promise you I can read. Let me start that over. I apologize. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. You return man to dust and say, Return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger, and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Again, that's Psalm 90 that we're going to unpack that psalm on this episode. So some good things. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, before we get down to business here, as usual, if you enjoy Loving the Scriptures and you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast. Also, follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And be sure, if you haven't done so already, as usual, to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End, What Jesus Taught His Disciples in the Olivet Discourse, an examination of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, as Jesus answers the disciples' question about when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. It's not a book on sensationalism, nor is it a book that sets a date on the second coming of Jesus Christ. Bible is abundantly clear. We do not know the day or the hour. So just so you get that, I get that out of the way, so I can assure you that what the book is not about. But again, it's examining that text of Scripture, that discourse, again, which is called the Olivet Discourse, and seeing what we can understand from it, how would the disciples have understood it, and how we navigate through all the time elements in that text. Is everything in their past? Is everything in their future? Is it a mix of the two? That sort of thing. So it takes a serious look at those things so that we can better understand what our Lord is saying, and then how we should be affected by that today, and how we should have a desire to live for Him, as a result of all the things that He's laid forth and that sort of thing. So that is Signs of the End. As usual, I'll leave a link in the episode description. We'll take you straight to Amazon so that you can order a copy. I encourage you to do so, and also to leave a review. Please do that as well. But I hope you order a copy. I hope you read it, and I hope that you're blessed by it. Okay, so Psalm 90. I mean, first of all, just a couple of things. Number one, just as far as in general, this is, as I've mentioned before, I think there'll be some times where we'll be going over some Psalms in this podcast. We've already covered a few, and they've kind of been scattered all throughout, weeks and months and that sort of thing. We've only looked at maybe a few, 3, maybe 4. I think it's 3 though, in the past year or two. And that might be more frequent now that we're not looking at a specific book. We've been over a month or two. We just finished our look at the book of John, the Gospel of John. And so there's a lot of things that we can look at. And one of the things I said is we'll take some times to look at some Psalms. Here's the thing: as I was for my own personal reading, because just in reading through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, just in my own personal reading, I'm in the Psalms right now. I'm at like Psalm 40, around there, and that sort of thing. And so as I've been reading through, I mean, there have been Psalms that I've been reading through. It's like, ooh, that would be a good one to talk about and to examine a little bit on the podcast. And ooh, I like this one. Ooh, I like this one. So there are a lot of options when it comes to exploring the Psalms and taking some time together, you and I, to examine them closely and to gain encouragement from that. And so hopefully we'll have more opportunities to do that. Now, as it relates to this specific psalm that we're looking at, Psalm 90, this, if you were to look at your Bible, there you would see, and if you looked at Psalm 90, you see that there would be a label on there to Psalm 90, which, I mean, that's the same thing for a bunch of Psalms, a lot of them attributing them to David. Some Psalms will say of David, or according to the choir master, or according to this, and then of David, or sometimes it'll have kind of a biographical thing where it says when David did this, or so forth and so on. Whatever like that. If you were to look at Psalm 90, you would see something very interesting where it labels this as a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Now, we think about the Psalms, and again, like I just mentioned David a few seconds ago, and we usually think David when it comes to the Psalms, although I think many of us know, maybe not everybody, but many of us know that not all the Psalms were written by David. I think most of us have an understanding of that, but I don't know if many people know or understand or remember. I mean, if they've come across this before, maybe they've forgotten or something like that, that we do have a psalm in the Psalter that is attributed to Moses. And so when we think about Moses, we usually don't think about a psalm, right? We think about, Egypt, let my people go, crossing the Red Sea, talking to God face to face, and that sort of thing. We usually don't think about Psalms or a psalm attributed to Moses. Now, as far as what this psalm is, I mean, it says that this is a prayer. It's labeled as a prayer, so it doesn't necessarily say a psalm of Moses or something like that, as you might see with somebody like David or something. But I mean, it is a prayer of Moses that is attached here to the Psalter, and specifically here in Psalm 90. And so the thing is that when it comes to this and seeing this through the eyes of somebody like Moses, you might think, okay, well then what is there a certain occasion that's going on with Moses that leads him to write this psalm or to pray this prayer to God and that sort of thing? Well, obviously it's not specific here. Of what that occasion might be. In a larger general sense, I think what most people understand, and I think there could be merit to this, just given the subject matter, is that this is sometime during the wilderness wanderings, the 40-year wandering in the wilderness. If you're familiar, if you remember, why that happened, of course, you had, when after Moses had led the people out of Egypt and led them to the border of the promised land, he sent spies out into the land, into the promised land to spy out the land. And then, they come back and they say the land is good, but the people there are mighty, that we can't defeat them. And so they spread a bad report as far as that goes. And so everybody started weeping and wailing, and then they turned against Moses. And then God said, okay, that's it. This generation, I think the age was like anybody 20 years or younger, they're able to enter into the land, but everybody older than that, forget it. And so you're going to wander in the desert, in the wilderness for a year for each day that the spies were spying out the land, which they were spying the land for 40 days. So that's where you get the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So from Moses's perspective, you can imagine, just the amount of death that he's seen in that entire span of time. Now, in the span, in my span of a lifetime, which is not too far over the 40 years that Moses would have spent wandering in the wilderness with everybody after that whole incident. If I take my own life experiences into account and things like that, I mean, I've seen death before. I mean, when I say I've seen death, I'm not talking about hearing about it on the news or that. I'm talking about people with people that I know, whether I know them well or acquaintances. I know who they are. I've spoken to them and that sort of thing. I've seen death, just as probably many of you have to a certain degree, but probably not close to the level that Moses has seen death. Okay, when it comes to the wilderness wanderings, because there's a lot of people in that group of Israelite people that he led out of Egypt, and just kind of if they're consigned to wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, with the amount of people there, I mean, it's you're gonna see a lot of death within that time frame, and I think that it's against this backdrop that we hear Moses saying these words and praying these words. Now, here's the thing that I'm going to say regarding Moses' situation as it relates to the wilderness. I think the way that I said that I arranged it, the way that I said it before, I think is important, is a key to possibly really understanding this psalm in a right way, is that the death that he sees as he's wandering through the wilderness is a backdrop that he uses that is used to remind him of the frailty of man and their transience on this life and on this earth all around. Okay. So what he sees with the Israelite people is true, in many ways to what anybody would experience, but there's a level of hope, and hope as it relates to this life for people who love God and who have a covenant relationship with him. And that's kind of what you see as you get near the end of that psalm, and kind of what Moses' appeal is to the Lord. But how he starts out here, and let's just start to dig into this here, because what he does to kind of set the stage for this, for the appeal that he makes towards God is acknowledging the vast difference, and this is a vast difference, the vast difference between God and who he is and his existence as God, and man and who they are and their existence on this earth. And what Moses recognizes and what he acknowledges to the Lord is that there is a wide chasm, there's a gulf there as it relates to all of that. So he starts out by saying in verse 1, where he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. And the reason why something like that is important is because, right off the bat, you get the sense that Moses is confessing his dependency and everybody else's dependency on God based on who he is in comparison to who they are. If we're talking about an eternal God who created the universe and everything in it, and this is what he goes on to say next. I mean, as far as his created nature, I mean, man really has no other choice but to depend on God. And everybody does to one degree or another. Everybody does. I mean, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and everything like that comes from God. If we're talking about things spiritually, I mean, we're all dependent on him spiritually, but not everybody, unfortunately, acknowledges that. People want to be the captain of their own souls and that sort of thing. They reject God, they reject Christ, and that sort of thing. But I mean, the idea, whether you're talking about somebody who acknowledges God or not, we are very dependent people when it comes to our life on this earth. And so Moses is one who recognizes that, and he uses God and his being and his eternal nature as kind of the introduction to that whole thing. So he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. Maybe another way that you can say this, and another word that you might have in your mind is refuge or something along those lines. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So there's kind of the key thing there. I mean, just as we're kicking this whole thing off, we as human beings, the only reference that we have to things are things having to do with time. Time, obviously time was not a thing, when there was just eternity. I mean, eternity past, and then you have time, and then you have eternity future, and all those sorts of things. I mean, time is kind of put in the middle of that whole thing. And like when God created the world and he created us, and then even us here in the 21st century, we're born into this world. The only frame of reference that we have is a frame of reference that's attached to time, and things that are measurable, and things that are around us that are created, nature and things like that. And so that's the only thing that we have. And so if you ever think of for a moment, or at least attempt to, maybe don't spend too much time on this, because your brain might start to smoke, because it's such a wondrous thing, and you just kind of wonder from our limited capacities as natural limited capacities as human beings. Have you ever thought the whole thing that there was a time? Well, I mean, even saying that is kind of weird, because again, that's the only time that's the only way that we can really adequately think of things from our own mind. But there was a quote unquote time when all of this wasn't here. Everything that we know of wasn't here. The sun didn't exist, the moon didn't exist. There was nothing here. What does that look like? I don't know. But it was just something that, even before the beginning, there was eternity all the way to the past. And within eternity is God, who's always existed. Now, if you think about what it is, and again, this plays into the finiteness of our thoughts and our thinking and everything like that. I think about, man, how is it possible for a being to never have a beginning and to have no start, and that sort of thing? He's always been in existence. I mean, you think about that, and then like your head starts to spin, and you get a little dizzy, and like I said, your head might start to smoke, because in our finite minds, that whole thing can't compute. Now with God, it's no problem. God, just according to his natural nature, he is an eternal being. So before all of this was here, of what we know and what we understand, God has always been. And then according to his timing and his purposes, he created the world, he created us, and all of these things that we know about here, not because he needed anything, and not because he needed us, not because he was lonely. I mean, he's Trinity. He's one God in three persons. I mean, he has adequate company with himself, and not because of anything of any need. I mean, if he's existed in eternity past, you would imagine that there was nothing that would crop up where there was no need, and then all of a sudden there is a need, and therefore he created the world and things like that. That's not how it worked. He's another part of his nature. And you might remember this when I've shared messages with you before, on our Attributes of God series. We talked about the self-sufficiency of God. That goes back into that whole thing. And so a self-sufficient God who creates the world, he creates man, he creates us, it doesn't take long for us to recognize and understand. Of course, if we have the spiritual ears to recognize and to hear and to see and everything, that we are dependent creatures. So Moses is one who, off the bat, who is saying that you've been our dwelling place in all generations. Yeah, that is true, especially when you take into account what he says in verse 2, which we just looked at. Before anything was even formed, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You've always been. And that speaks to the immutability as well, to a certain degree. He's always been God. There's nothing in him that changes and everything and everything like that. So as far as his being is concerned, he's eternal and he's immutable. He's always been here, and he created us and everything like that. Now, he goes in as he continues on in this psalm. You get the sense that that compared to the eternality of God as it relates to us as human beings in the physical world and in this world and in this that we know right now, and if we're talking about on this side of eternity and things like that, that we are very finite and transient beings. Okay. And so in verse 3, it says, "You return man to dust and say, 'Return, O children of man.'" Now, what's interesting here in verse 3, you get the whole thing of, you return man to dust and say, "Return, O children of man." You get this whole thing of return to dust. And remember that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which would include Genesis. So this kind of has a ring of what Moses has written about, even as it relates to that. Remember, after the fall, he says, "For dust you are, and dust you shall return," because he made man out of the dust and everything like that. But the one thing to notice here is that he says that you return man to dust and say, "Return, O children of man." Okay, you do this. And this is an important point to make, because, when it comes to death, there's no death that happens that's outside of the will of God, no matter what the form of it, whether we're talking about something that happened with a tragedy, whether it's talking about somebody who died of old age, whether we're talking about somebody who contracted an illness or anything like that. There's no death that happens outside of the will of God. In other words, death isn't something where, something just escapes God and it's like, whoops, I totally could have prevented that. I missed that there. I'm sorry, that sort of thing. It's like you return man to dust. Now you can look at it from a general perspective and a specific. I just mentioned a specific a couple minutes ago, but again, from the broader sense of this, again, that goes back to what he wrote in Genesis. "For dust you are, and dust you shall return." He sentences man to this whole thing of death because of the sin of man, because of the sin of our first parents. Verse 4, he says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night." So the thing that we have here, and the thing that would be that might be recognizable for people who are familiar with Scripture, this whole thing where he says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday." You might know that Peter used a similar language in 2 Peter chapter 3 when he's explaining the seemingly slow fulfillment of God's promise of Christ's return, where he says, "For to the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day." He uses that to highlight that man's understanding of slowness is not the same as God's. You're working on two totally different playing fields as it relates to that. So really, there isn't any sort of slowness as it relates to God in keeping His promise. That's the big feature of what he's saying there. And so you have the same concept here, but I think with a little bit of a difference on how we can look at this, because again, remember, with Moses, understanding that Moses was the author of Genesis, you remember a couple of those places where he, and we can even say pre-Genesis 6, so pre-Noah, where he has a genealogical list of people and lists off their names and the years, the number of years that they lived. You'll quickly recognize that that many of those people lived for over 900 years. And so close to 1,000. I don't think anybody in that list broke the 1,000-year barrier. Now that's just from that list. Were there other people outside of that list that lived for maybe a little over 1,000 years? Maybe. But I mean, as far as if we're going by the list in Scripture, that's, you're close to 1,000 years. And so just think about that. There was a time when people lived for almost 1,000 years. They lived for 950 years, 980, whatever the case, 900 and something years. And you get the sense that was life to their fullest. I mean, the fullest days of life. So if we think about this, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You can kind of think about, even for those people back then, a whole person's lifetime, nearly their whole lifetime, is just as a snap of a finger in the sight of God. It's not very much at all. Again, we're thinking about this, excuse me, in light of eternity. So really, when it comes to us and we think about our life and our days, we think that, really there isn't a lot of time that we have here on this earth. Moses would even say that even for people for 1,000 years. So just think about that. Nobody lives that long anymore. So how much more does this speak to us today for people who live 70, 80, 90 years, maybe even 100 years, right? And that's really pushing it, right? That sort of thing. So that just gives us the perspective from a divine perspective. 1,000 years in His sight is but as yesterday as when it is past. Verse 5, it says, you sweep them away with a flood. They are like a dream. So here he's starting to talk about how transient we are and how swift it is, where we go from the beginning of our time all the way to the end. I mean, it's really, again, when we have eternity in mind, it's really nothing at all. So we're here one moment and then we're gone the next, essentially. We don't have a lot of time on this earth. And so it said, and notice how Moses describes this. He says, you sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream. And a dream is, again, you're speaking about things that happen within a night. You have a dream at night that happens at night when you sleep. A dream is there at night, and then when you wake up, it's gone. That's how quick, that's how swift, that's how transient our lives are on this earth. He goes on with more illustrations there. He says, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning, it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening, it fades and withers. So just consider the contrast here. And then when you compare that to human life, I mean, we might think about, when life begins and things like that. And even when life and babies come into this world, they're little, they're small, they're vibrant, they're energetic. We look at that, you're like, man, you've got so many years ahead of you. But really on the scale of eternity, they're here once and at once and then gone, not too long after that. Now, of course, again, from a human perspective, it does seem like a long time. But it really isn't. What's interesting, though, is that, in our younger years, I know that when I was younger, I heard from time to time older people saying that once you reach a certain time in your life, once you reach a certain age, time seems to go faster. Right. And I'm realizing just how true that is. When I was young, and even when I was in my mid to late teens, it was almost as if, man, you can't grow up fast enough. But then you reach a certain age, maybe 30, 35 or that sort of thing. And then before you know it, of course, time is time. I mean, it doesn't literally go faster, but I mean, as far as our perception of time, it goes by just like that. And, people who have said, the older you get, the faster time seems to go. They're correct, at least from my perspective. I can certainly identify with that. And so it's just very, so just even from a perception standpoint, you kind of get a little bit of a sense of that. And you look back on your life and you think, man, where did all the years go? I mean, it was here just a few months ago. And now it just seems like I've advanced like a decade, where did the time go? That sort of thing. Now here in verse 7, for we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. Now, we get this whole thing of God's anger entering into the picture, and we might wonder, where in the world is that coming from? I think in this area here. And look, let me I just read verse 7. Let me go ahead and read verse 8 as well. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Okay, so there's the anger of God and everything, and the wrath that he talks about, and then he talks about our iniquities being before God and everything like that. This is where I think, the whole backdrop of Moses' specific situation of the wilderness wanderings might come into play, because specifically in that sense, you are dealing with the anger of God, the anger and wrath of God. Now, I would hesitate to say that that's a perpetual wrath that stayed with him for 40 years. I mean, God was angry with them at the moment and then said that, for 40, you're not going to enter into the promised land. And for 40 years, you're going to wander in the desert until you die. And then the younger generation, we're going to come back to Canaan and they're going to take possession of the land that you were supposed to enter into with your children, but now you're not going to, and that sort of thing. So now you're wandering around in the desert, and people are dying left and right, with people, with all of those people, the older generation being prohibited from entering into the promised land. And so that serving as a reminder in that specific sense of God's wrath and his anger against them because of their lack of faith, and even trying to encourage one another by saying we need to get a leader to lead us back to Egypt and that sort of thing. Just, with all of the miraculous signs that God had done against the Egyptians, and with the powerful hand that he had to bring them out of Egypt. I mean, it's kind of an unthinkable thing that they would even say things like that. And so, there is an element of God's anger and God's wrath and that sort of thing. But again, if we're looking at this from the perspective of a backdrop, that as a backdrop of what is generally and overall true for man in general, I think you can kind of you can kind of see it as the same thing, because we're dealing with the wrath of God, a judgment on man because of sin, right? Because of Adam's sin, and everybody born into this world is born in Adam, and being born in Adam means, through his disobedience, everybody else, just as he dies, so we also all die as well. Just as a reminder, just looking back here at Romans chapter 5, this is kind of the keynote passage here that kind of lays all of this out in verse 12 and following, where Paul says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. So death came to everybody because they were in Adam and born in Adam. And because they were born in Adam, because we were all had been born in Adam, we were all sinners just by that right. Now, obviously, just as we take into account our lives and our living, we have committed acts of sin, right? And so that's just something that compounds the situation of who we were when we were born in Adam. We were labeled as sinners because of our attachment to Adam. And so from Adam comes death. And so that's why you see what you see all around. You see the effects of that just by the mere fact that there's death that happens. And that's part of the judgment of God. The judgment of God, which again, you can say that's attached to his anger and his wrath and that sort of thing, is that people die, including us as Christians. Short of the second coming of Christ, if we don't live to see the second coming of Christ, we're going to die just like everybody else. Now, here's what I want you to understand as it relates to this. If we're looking at this from the general overall perspective, okay? This isn't saying that everybody, when it comes time for us to die, when we die, it's as a result of God's specific anger with us at that moment, because of, situation A, B, C, or D, or that sort of thing. Even if you're talking about somebody who lives to be 100 and they die of old age, we're not to understand what Moses is saying here as something as if to say that when the time came for that person to die, and let's just assume that they're a believer in Christ, that God was angry with them at that moment, and that's the reason why they died. That's not the case at all. Even when we're talking about people who come down with life-threatening illnesses and things like that, we can't be ones who automatically say, oh, well, God must be angry with them about something. They must have done something, and now because of this, they're going to die and that sort of thing. I mean, if you want to be imitators of Job's friends, go ahead and think that, but it's not always necessarily the case that's what's going on. What we should be seeing here from the general overall perspective is that death is a result of sin, and again, we're talking in general terms here, and that is a judgment of God, and so as a judgment of God, this is an expression of His wrath and His anger. And that sort of thing, things that even we as Christians are ones who experience. Now, the good news with us as Christians is that we don't stay dead. We don't stay in the grave. Number one, even if we're not talking about the body, absent from the body is present with the Lord. That's number one. But number two, when it comes to the second coming of Christ, the resurrection, our bodies are going to be raised into a glorious body, and that will see no destruction or decay and that sort of thing. Now, Moses isn't going into that here right now, so we don't need to highlight all of that right now. That's not where Moses goes. But again, I think to understand the whole thing of his wrath and things like that, again, verse 7, for we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. And isn't this something, again, by the way, as believers in Christ, we are people who still struggle with sin from time to time, right? Sin is still a struggle. So, it's not like sins go away. The record of sins and what we would be held accountable for is gone away because it's been paid by Christ. But our struggle with sin in this life and everything like that, we still have struggles with sin and that sort of thing. So there's still an element where the problems with man in general still comes forth even with people who believe. When people become believers, they don't become perfect, in the flesh, or that sort of thing. I'm sure that anybody listening to this will give a hearty amen to that. Now, we are being changed progressively into the image of Christ, but we aren't going to reach perfection in this life. We have to wait until Christ comes back for that to happen. But there you have the whole thing of sin and the presence of sin and how that's in the sight of God. But again, just want to remind you from the perspective of God's perspective of us as a believer, He doesn't see helpless, worthless sinners or that sort of thing. He sees the perfection of Christ in us because of justification. It doesn't mean that God is unaware with the sin that we struggle with. But again, it's something that he doesn't hold against us, or doesn't appear on our record, or that sort of thing. I think it's important to, just kind of remind you of that, though. Verse 9, for all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. Now, this kind of talks about the wrath of God as it relates to the death in general from a lifetime perspective. Because again, notice where it says there is like, for all our days pass away under your wrath. So it's like we're looking at, if we're looking at our life and our existence, for however long we've lived up to this point. Moses is one. It says our days pass away under your wrath. And again, I think one of the ways to look at that is just to see and understand that when it comes to our existence in this life, we see things and we experience things that are evidence of the wrath of God. And again, that would equate to the presence of sin in general and the problem of sin in this world. Even as it relates to problems with our physical bodies. I can tell you for myself, I experience things with my body now that I didn't have a problem with when I was a teenager in my early 20s or even in my late 20s. There are certain things that I can't do now that I was able to do before. There are things that I'm more susceptible to, just as far as illnesses are concerned and that sort of thing, and things that make, kind of have the threat of on the horizon. I mean, to be honest, when I go to the doctor and that sort of thing, it's like, we need to keep an eye on this or that or something like that, because that might serve as a problem down the road, so forth and so on, and that sort of thing. And just that alone kind of gives us an understanding of that. Not to mention the other things that we see in this life, maybe even not connected to things that we experience physically or that sort of thing. Just the problems that we have all along in this life, maybe because of the consequences of sins that we commit in this life, or our relationships with other people and the things that they do that might hurt us or might cause us trouble or that sort of thing. Dealing with evil and wicked people in our world. If we're dealing with wicked and evil people in our governments who are running the show or that sort of thing, and how that might affect us and all those things. You can get specific with even people now of having to work harder and harder to make ends meet. I mean, this psalm talks about the toil that we endure and that sort of thing. And especially now where like every single thing seems to be super, super expensive now, especially at the grocery store, gasoline, all those sorts of things. Now, I mean, even though those things might be trials, those things are really small compared to what a lot of other things that people or we ourselves might go through. But again, it's it all boils down to the troubles that we have in this life boils down to, in a general sense, sin in this world. Speak to anybody in this world who has a memory, has any sort of memory in this world, or can tell stories about their lifetime. Nobody will tell you that their whole life has been easy. It has been cruising on easy street. All of us have our problems. All of us have our struggles. All of us have our pains, our trials, and that sort of thing. And so when we read Moses' words here, it says, for all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. You think about, so he says, when our time comes to an end, it's kind of like a, sort of thing. It's a tiresome sort of expression. It's kind of a exasperated, tired, it's just kind of, there are all sorts of descriptive words that you can use that are attached to that. But all of those are expressions of the trouble that we have in this life, what Moses considers under your wrath, and how we bring our years to an end like a sigh. Verse 10, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet, now that's something in and of itself, noteworthy. But I mean, the point is made after what he says there. He says, yet their span is but toil and trouble. So basically, what we've been talking about the last few minutes. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Okay, so with the limited, so if we're looking at the limited nature of our days, limited nature. And Moses is saying in all of those days are just filled with, is filled with toil and trouble, as it says there. Now, notice he's saying the years of our life are 70. Now, again, that's not a lot when lined up with eternity. But from a human perspective, even when you think of 70, you might think, man, that's a lot of years. Okay, even if you think that that's a lot of years, it's filled with toil and trouble, right? Now there are exceptions to the people living to 70 or even by reason of strength 80. By the time Moses writes this, the lifespan of man has reduced significantly. Like I said, in the earlier parts of Genesis, you had people who were living for nearly 1,000 years. And then as you go through the Genesis record, you understand and see how significantly life has pared down. I mean, I think Abraham was one who only lived for, I think the Bible says 175 years. Moses himself is one who, he's writing saying that, your years are 70, 80 if you have by reason of strength. There are exceptions, and Moses was one of them, because in Deuteronomy 34, I believe it says, in that closing epilogue, it says that Moses had lived to 120 years. So that's a long time. And of course, there are exceptions to even what we have, what we normally think of as a normal lifespan. Before coming into this time, I looked up and I looked up in Google and asked who the oldest person alive was, or I guess is, if they're still alive. And it's a lady named Ethel, I forget her last name. So as of this recording right now, the oldest person alive is a Ethel something or other. Again, I forget her last name. She's 116 right now. So yeah, she's seen a lot more years, but again, probably a lot more time to have all the troubles of this world compacted in that time, just like everybody else in their lifetimes and things like that. She's approaching 117 because if I remember correctly, her birthday is in early August, so about 2 or 3 months away from now. She'll if she survives, she continues to survive, she'll live to see 117, which is amazing, by the way. People who live a long time, I'm always fascinated by that, because I just think of as somebody who has an interest in history, I think about, what sort of history they were alive to see that maybe I wasn't around to see. I thought the same thing about my grandma. My grandma lived to be 100 years old. And then after she turned 100 years old, she died like a week later after that. So she lived 100 years and 1 week. She was born in 1911, and, just think, okay, man, that's just think about, the history that she lived through, and even what was a reality, just when she was alive. Maybe not necessarily what she remembered when she was a little kid, but maybe like you can say, man, my grandmother was alive when this happened, or that sort of thing. Just to kind of put it in perspective, and this isn't anything about the lesson, this is kind of a small sidetrack, but I always think about, my grandma, and this is my grandma on my mother's side, the one who had lived 100 years. She was born in 1911. So just think, she was born when Taft was president. So just that puts you into things into perspective. Right before the 1912 presidential election, in which Woodrow Wilson would be elected president, my grandma was about maybe 5 or 6 months old-ish around there when Titanic sank. You should kind of think, man, these certain things had happened in history when my grandmother was alive and that sort of thing. So that's always fascinated me. Anyway, that's neither here nor there and about the text. And I'm sorry, I just went on that rabbit trail, just kind of thinking about the exceptions of people who live a long time. But whether you're talking about somebody who's lived 100 years, 110 years, where you're talking about somebody who's lived 70 years, 80 years, 60 years. I think Moses, what Moses has to say here in Psalm 90 is the same, though. So even though Moses is one who's maybe an exception of, what he even lays out in this with his pen here, he would understand. And of course he would understand, because he was one who had to wander around with these people in the wilderness for 40 years. And then he himself, because of a particular sin that he committed, wasn't allowed to enter into the promised land. And he died short of that as well. So, so Moses would be one who would understand this, probably, very much to a T, in all of this. And so, they are soon gone and we fly away. So again, it's just kind of talking about the transience of our existence, and just the things that they're filled with. Verse 11, who considers the power of your anger? So there's the whole thing with anger again, and your wrath according to the fear of you. What fascinates me about this verse, because again, he talks about the power of your anger. And again, the power of your anger in this context, I think he's talking about as it relates to the reality of death for every human being. And even for the deaths of the people in front of him and the people that he was leading in the wilderness, but even all around, if we're talking about mankind in general, the power of his anger. And just think about that, because if you think about it, that's really true of talking about power in that sense. We talk about when life comes into the world, and the power and the miraculous nature of this, of God creating and putting us together and knitting infants in the womb and that sort of thing. And we think, just the wonderful power of God to be able to create life, and that sort of thing. And that truly is a wonderful thing and speaks to the power of God, because, on our own, we're not able to do that. I mean, we're participants in the creation process just by reproduction and that sort of thing. But those are things that God gave us, and God, put those things together so that, he knits, life together, all those sorts of things. But if you think about it, when it comes to death, no matter what you're talking about, no matter who you're talking about, if we're talking about a sovereign God where death doesn't slip through his fingers for anybody, and life ends, and it doesn't have to be because he's harsh or angry with a particular person when that happens, but it's just a matter of, for example, for a lot of people, for somebody that who's lived a long life and they die and they're a believer, some of the things that people might say to talk about that is that the Lord took that person home, that sort of thing. You can talk about that, whether you're talking about that or whether you're talking about something else, you're talking about the same thing. The power, even as it relates to death, and the power of the anger, because again, we're talking about anger, we're talking about judgment, we're talking about judgment as a result of sin. And again, we're talking about in a general sense. There's power in the whole reality of God taking away life from somebody as well. You ever thought about that? I mean, we think about, somebody who died of natural causes, let's say. And I'm not saying don't use that term or that it's not correct or anything like that. Again, we're looking at this from a human perspective. Somebody died of natural causes. But really, if we're talking about a sovereign God who, again, let's say how we usually do within our own circles, so they took somebody home. The reality is that God ceased that person's life, right? And there's power in something like that. I mean, for God to just bring somebody's life to non-existence in a physical sense. That's truly a powerful thing. That's not anything that we can do. I mean, people can end their lives, but it's not something that's done naturally. Is what I'm saying. And just a natural move of God of taking somebody's life away. And Moses, I think, would be one saying, this is, who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you. And just if you think about that, you just kind of be in awe of just understanding that God has that power in his hands, right? So in verse 12, proceeding on in verse 12, it says, so here's the appeal that Moses makes after all the things that he's laid out there. Here's the appeal that he makes to God, where he says, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. So in other words, he's saying, open up our minds and give us this understanding of the fact that we have limited time here. And so with the reminder of the limited nature of our days, Not even to mention the fact that we don't know what a day will bring. I mean, we might assume that we'll live to old age, but that's not necessarily true. I could jump in my car after I do this podcast and get into a car accident. Not to get all downer on you and things like that here, but I mean, again, that's a real possibility. So which actually talks about the fragility of our lives as well. But even so, if we understand that, our lives, our days are limited here, and, on the it's a speck on the whole span of eternity. And so we don't have a lot of time here on this earth. Moses is one who's saying, help us to see that for what it really is. Teach us to number our days. Help us to understand and to know that, as far as our time here on this earth, you don't have a lot of it. It's kind of, you look at Psalm 39, it's a Psalm of David. You read in verses 4 and 5, where he says, "O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days." It's kind of along the same lines of what Moses is saying. "Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths." So in other words, very short. "And my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath." Okay. And David, so that's Psalm 39, verses 4 and 5. That's a Psalm of David. And David was one who lived to be an old man, right? Yet he was one who says, "Teach me, help me to see how fleeting my life is, and that my days here are very short." And so as what Moses says here in Psalm 90, he says, "Teach us to number our days." For what purpose? That we may get a heart of wisdom, so that it might put us into better perspective. And then as we're talking about wisdom, as far as wisdom is concerned, the way that we should look at wisdom is the proper application of the knowledge that we have. So now, with the knowledge of us knowing how limited we are, how transient our life is, and how fragile our lives are, let us have a heart of wisdom in how to live those days in the proper way, given what we now know about that. Right? Or what we're reminded of, about that, and that sort of thing. That's the appeal that's being made there. Verse 13, "Return, O Lord, how long?" Now, why is he saying that? He goes on to say in that verse, "Have pity on your servants," because again, Moses is writing this, in light of what he's just described before, especially as our lives, no matter how long they are, filled with toil and trouble. So the question would be, is that the only thing that we have here in this earth? And I know we have eternity, and even from a Christian perspective, I mean, we know that, we have eternity with the Lord in our future and that sort of thing. But even in this life, are we only to look at this as this sort of thing, like all the things that we see are trouble and toil and hardship and that sort of thing? Hopefully, for people who have experienced a lot of the goodness that's on this earth, that God has provided by His own hand, we understand that there is room for those sorts of things. The thing that we need to understand and that we need to know is that those are gifts from God, that we can enjoy certain things in life while we're here on this earth. And that's what Moses is kind of appealing to and saying that, this is kind of what we want. This is kind of what we want. "Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants." Verse 14. Now this is the big thing here in verse 14. "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days." And the whole thing of all our days, all what days? I mean, all our days as far as all that we exist. But remember how he described our days in a collective sense, full of toil and trouble, right? "We feel the weight of your wrath," another way that he put it there. So what's he appealing to? He's appealing to having joy and having the ability to rejoice in those days. But it's not just a nebulous sort of thing where we just say, okay, I just rejoice and I can just let me be happy and that sort of thing. Because again, notice what he says there in verse 14. "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love." Another way of talking about steadfast love, when we're talking about steadfast love in places like the Psalm or other places in the Old Testament, usually what we're talking about, the meaning behind that is a covenantal love, the covenantal love that God has for His people. And you might ask, well, does that apply to us? Because we're talking about a covenant people of God, doesn't that relate just to Israel? Well, no. I mean, we can look at things through a New Testament lens. And if you've been paying attention to things that we've talked about, over several weeks related to how we understand the church in Israel and that sort of thing, we understand God's intention for the Jew and the Gentile making one and that sort of thing. We don't need to go to a complete review of all of that. But again, even in a covenantal sense, we're under the new covenant. There is a covenant that's in play, right? A covenant from God, for his people. And so in a covenantal sense, there is the love that is established there, because not everybody is of that covenant. Unbelievers aren't part of the new covenant. They're just not, and I don't think I'm saying anything new or surprising or earth-shattering here. That's just the reality of how things are. Okay. So, it says, he says, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. And I guess another way of putting this is an appeal to relationship. As there's that covenant faithfulness from God to man, and vice versa. There's that love there. There's that loving relationship that's there. So even though we exist in a world where there's all sorts of trouble, all sorts of pain, man is destined to trouble as sparks fly upward, as it says in Job, right? There is room for joy and rejoicing, but it comes in the Lord, and it comes with a covenantal love that satisfies us because we are attached to him. And he's the only source of that satisfaction, right? So, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Verse 15, make us glad. And listen to this. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. That's a really powerful prayer there, if you ask me. And for as many years as we have seen evil. So in other words, Moses is one is saying like, please have it be where we're not ones who the only thing that we're exposed to is evil and hardship and trouble and wickedness and all those sorts of things. For as many of the days that we've seen those things, may we have just as many days where we have joy in you, I think, and that's kind of what we're having there, and that's something that we can have. That's really what biblical joy is. If you really think about joy and all that it's about, joy is something that you have in the Lord, and that's a joy that is maintained regardless of the circumstances, right? So even if our days are filled with trouble and toil and that sort of thing, we can still maintain joy because we are attached to the one in whom we have covenant relationship with. The covenant love that he has for us, by which we are satisfied, right? That's the whole idea. And so his whole thing is, let us, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. And notice again, the affliction, he recognizes the affliction comes from God. Again, we can see how that plays out specifically in Moses' case, if we're talking about a wilderness wandering. In a general and broader sense, if we're talking about sin and things like that, the effects of sin and the consequences of sin, we are ones who experiences those things, but it's by the decree of God that all of those things have their place. It said, so make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen evil. Verse 16, let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. And this is a wonderful request from the hand of Moses here, as he's praying this to God. Part of the whole thing of being satisfied in the Lord is seeing him at work. I mean, if we just want to simplify this term here in verse 16, I think it boils down to letting us see the Lord at work. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. And be careful here, because I don't want to get, exclusively charismatic here, where we think, okay, power and work of God, okay, that means, oh, let's go and see how many people we can raise from the dead and blah, blah, that sort of thing. That sort of thing, that's not what we're talking about. God, I don't think God is in the business of raising so many people from the dead. That's something that is in store for well, actually, literally, actually for everybody, but resurrection unto eternal life just for those who belong to him. But I mean, we're talking about power. You can talk about it in so many ways. We can behold the power of God as it relates to his work in our lives. Really, if you think about it, that's what sanctification is. Sanctification is the work of God's power in us to transform us progressively more and more into the likeness of Christ. We can behold the power of God as it relates to his working in our circumstances. Ever been in a situation where you see God at work in circumstances that have a solution that there's no way that we could have had a hand in that solution or anybody else? You look at that and you say, wow, that is totally 1,000,000,000% a work of God. No doubt about it, right? Ever been in that situation? We can rejoice at seeing the power of God work in other people that we know. We can see the power of God as it relates to seeing hearts change and people turning in salvation to the Lord Jesus Christ. Those things count. It doesn't necessarily have to be, this whole thing of do a big sign in the heavens and in the stars and that sort of thing, and there we can see your power, just like the Israelites would have done, and back at that time, they saw the Red Sea pile up and divide into two, so that there's a path of ground there so that they can cross the Red Sea when the Egyptians were chasing them. That does count as God's power, but but let's not be narrow in our thinking of power here. God's power is exhibited in so many ways, and God, by his own sovereign choice, chooses not to operate in as much in the same way that he did in the Old Testament and that sort of thing. I would be one to say that you weren't dealing with a situation where people were seeing God's power in that sense every day either, if we're really wanting to be honest about it. But I just want you to understand that the power of God and seeing God at work takes on some of those other forms as well that I just mentioned before, and we see the Lord's hand in people, in situations. We see the power of God as we see people starting to glorify his name, again, as it relates to people converting and turning to the Lord Jesus Christ, all those sorts of things. And in many other ways, I'm pretty sure you can witness and behold the power of God. But the whole thing is, and when you see those things, do you not rejoice? And aren't you filled with joy and seeing God glorified and exalted in even what he does, and that we have the privilege to be able to see and behold those things? Yes, even in the span of this life that we're in right now, which is filled with trouble and that sort of thing, we get glimpses of the work of God in our lives, the power of God, the glory of God. Even as I said, even as it relates to what he does in our lives, I think that's truly amazing. So he says, let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. So we're talking about let's have this privilege be passed on to the next generation as well. And hopefully that's something that's a desire that you have for the next generation as well, even as it relates to your family. And actually, as it turns out, I mean, that this can play into what Moses says next here, in the last verse here, verse 17. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So notice in verse 16, there's the Lord's work. Let your work be shown to your servants and everything. And then in verse 17, in the middle of verse 17, at the very end, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And here's what I think Moses is relaying here. Moses isn't talking about, when he's saying, establish the work of our hands, as in, all the worldly and earthly goals that I want to pursue and things like that, and things that I want to do my bucket list and everything like that. Now, God can be gracious and allow you to do those things. I don't discount those things, but I don't think that that's primarily what Moses is having in mind here. I think the work of our hands, as he calls it there in that last verse, is connected to the power of God. Let your work be shown in the power and everything like that, in the sense that let God's power and his work be upon us so that we can live for his purposes. And if we want to connect this even more to what we've just seen in the last few minutes, as we're satisfied in his covenant love, and we continue to grow in that relationship in this life that's filled with trouble, and we want to see the power of God at work. But how Moses caps this off is that let us be participants of that power. Not that we have power in ourselves or anything like that. Again, we're not getting charismatic or anything like that here. It's just a matter of use your power to empower us, to give us strength to be able to do your work. So the work of our hands is our hands doing the work according to your power and according to your purposes. That's why I say, even as it relates to things of the next generation, one of the things that we're talking about, if we're wanting to talk about establish the work of our hands, having that being a prayer of the Lord. If you're one, I mean, not everybody has a family that they're raising, but many people do. This is just an example. If you have a family, if you're raising a family, you have a wife and kids, or you're a husband and a wife, and you're raising kids and that sort of thing, that automatically qualifies. I mean, as far as establish the work of our hands, there's something to be said about appealing to God to give you the strength and the power to be able to walk in the right path of raising your kids, in doing it right in a way of raising godly offspring, having in mind an intentional mindset of raising the next generation to be centered on God and having them in a position to be able to behold the strength and power of God in their lives as well. That sort of thing, and passing that on to the next generation. Now, we're talking about things outside of a family context because, again, this could spread out into all sorts of contexts. But let me tell you what I don't believe this means. This doesn't necessarily mean, and I don't want people to get carried away with this, where it says establish the work of our hands, that only and exclusively means, okay, well, we need to go and we need to found 100 missions corporations and organizations, and we need to do this and plant all these different ministries and that sort of thing. And that's exclusively what we mean by establish the work of our hands. Now, if God leads somebody to do that, that obviously would be the case as well, as God would lead that person and give them the strength and the power to be able to do that for his purposes and for his glory. Again, that's the emphasis that I want to lay forth here. So that being participants by the power of God for his purposes is something that gives us joy, and we're able to see and able to enjoy in this life. Again, in this life that's filled with trouble and turmoil and toil and that sort of thing. Again, it could be a matter of raising your family. It could be a matter of, being intentional as far as ministering to people on your at your workplace, at your job. There's purpose. That can give you a sense of purpose when you look at, even if you're just talking about your job. And again, we're assuming in this case like a job that's not connected to a church job or for a Christian organization or that sort of thing. Your job can be more than just going someplace to work to get a paycheck, because for a lot of people that's what it is. But if you're looking at it as an opportunity to develop relationships with people and looking for opportunities to be able to share Christ with people and to show them the love of God that's evident in your life and passed off onto them. Those are things, again, by the power of God that we're able to see, and hopefully other people are able to see and witness. And then as the prayer says there, establish the work of our hands. Let this be something that has something to show as time goes on down the line. Let it leave a healthy legacy. And again, that goes back to the whole thing of people, of even your children being able to see the power of God, and things being passed off to them. So that kind of, when you look at it in that way, you see how life can be purposeful in this life when you have God at the center of it, right? And being in covenant relationship with him. And the idea of wanting our works to be established is our works to be of our hands being established through his work that's done in and through us for his glory and for his purposes. That's what I think that Moses is getting at when you get to the end of that psalm. And so we're talking about teach us to number our days. I think it's the old translation. I don't know what the newer NIV translations say, but I know in the old 1984 version, it says, help us to number our days aright. Give us a right understanding of our days so that we can get a heart of wisdom. So in other words, that it brings all the more into perspective. We don't have a lot of time on this earth. How do we want to spend our time? Now, of course, the specifics of that varies from person to person or from family to family. But again, the idea is to have the right and proper mindset so that we're not in the business of wasting our time and wasting our days, but that we have our minds focused on, okay, Lord, in the days of trouble and turmoil in this life right now, in the shortness and the transient nature of it, what do you have for me or for my family or whatever the case might be here while I'm on this earth? Because my desire as I continue to grow in love and relationship with you is to see your purposes prevail by your power working in me, so that the work of my hands is actually from the power of your hand to see that established. And I want to see that established and to take root. Okay. That is the perspective of somebody who's able to, who God is working with, to be able to help them to see the number of their days, to be able to count it aright. And understanding that our days are fleeting, and so we don't want to waste that. Not to say that it's wrong to have enjoyments of other kinds as well. Of course, God provides those things, I believe, as a gift to his people. But again, the whole idea is having a right perspective on things, and then letting God be glorified through that, even in the days that are troublesome and tiring and toilsome. Okay, so I think that that's a wonderful psalm that we have, and take some time to meditate on that. Read through the psalm again on your own time. I would encourage you to do that. If there are any other meditations that you have that you want to chew on and maybe there's certain things that stuck out from this psalm that you want to spend more time thinking about, please, by all means, do that, and do that prayerfully. Let God speak to you through his word as you continue to meditate on what we've talked about here, what his word says, and that sort of thing. And that's not that, to be truthful, is a way of growing in your relationship with God, communing with him through time in the word. So that's all at your disposal as well. And it's certainly a wonderful and gracious gift of God that he's given us to be able to do that in these days. All right, well, we'll go ahead and leave it there for now. Hope that you enjoyed this episode, and hope that it spoke well to you, and that it serves as something profitable for you. If you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, again, please go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast, and then also be sure to follow me on X. Again, the handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And then again, please don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End, What Jesus Taught His Disciples in the Olivet Discourse. As usual, leave a link in the episode description, take you to Amazon. Please order a copy and leave a review. Leave a review. I would greatly appreciate it if you did that as well. All right, well, that's all that I have for you. I hope you had a good time. I had a good time going through scripture with all of you as usual. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.